I never expected to see my parents again, at least not in any real capacity. I'd cut them off 8 years ago when I was 22, and I thought they'd be more than happy to let me stay gone. My father once told me, in front of the whole family, that I was a mistake he wished he could forget. My mother stayed silent, and when I looked at her for any sign of protest, she stared at the floor. I remember that day so vividly because it was the moment I realized nothing I did would ever measure up to my sister's achievements or my brother's effortless popularity. They always had shining report cards, sports trophies, or glamorous life updates to share, while I struggled to find my footing. I was always the weird kid who liked to tinker with old electronics, write short stories, and watch documentaries. My parents never saw that as valuable. They called me the dreamer with a sneer. In high school, I tried to fit in by picking up a sport, soccer, and I nearly ruined my knee. I tried to join the math club, but that brought me exactly zero approval. In the end, I gave up on their praise because it felt impossible to attain. My sister, Karina, had a plan from the time she was 10. She wanted to go to medical school, marry someone equally driven, and create a thriving lifestyle. She managed the first part with ease. By the time she was in her residency, she was already engaged to a wealthy cardiologist. My parents adored her success. They told everyone how proud they were of her. Whenever I was around, they made me feel like I was there to fill some silent quota. Yes, they had another child, but no one needed to pay attention to me. My older brother, Kyle, was the popular one. He played football throughout high school, dated the head cheerleader, and graduated with a business degree. He bragged about partying with influential people and always seemed on the verge of the next big deal, though in truth, he was mostly blowing hot air. Still, it didn't matter. He was charismatic, always knew the right things to say, and had that glow that made people see potential in him whether he delivered or not. My parents adored him too, even when his business ventures flopped or teetered on the edge of legality. In contrast, I graduated college with a degree in English. I didn't walk during the ceremony because my parents said it was a waste of time. I taught for a couple of years, then realized I hated being stuck in a bureaucratic school system. Eventually, I found a niche doing technical writing at a small startup, which let me merge my love of technology with my skill at explaining concepts in clear language. It didn't pay as well as I would have liked, but at least I found a measure of fulfillment. None of that mattered to my parents. They'd corner me at every family gathering, telling me to get a real job or do something that actually mattered. No matter how often I tried to explain what I did, they tuned me out. I tried to get them interested in the fact that my startup was on the verge of releasing a new consumer product, or that I was leading a small team. They'd barely nod and then pivot back to my siblings' successes. The final straw came at Karina's wedding when my father cornered me after the ceremony. Everyone else was in high spirits. My mother was beaming, Karina was glowing in her perfect lace dress, and Kyle was charming everyone at the open bar. Then my father approached me with a glass of champagne in hand. He muttered that I'd better not embarrass anyone tonight or cause any unnecessary drama. That was all he said. He didn't thank me for flying in. He didn't notice I'd saved for weeks just to afford a decent outfit and a plane ticket. Instead, he insinuated that my presence was a liability. At the reception, he toasted Karina for being the pride of the family. He praised Kyle for his connections, his hustle, and his fearless approach to life. I was never mentioned. When Karina threw the bouquet, she teased me in front of everyone that maybe if I caught it, I'd finally have a good reason to get my act together. People laughed politely, but that moment was seared into my heart as the final humiliation. I left before the cake was served. I whispered an apology to a couple of distant cousins on my way out, but that was it. I wish I could say I had a rousing speech prepared for the moment I decided to cut contact, but all I did was draft a short email the next week stating that I needed space. I didn't blame them in the letter. I just said I was tired of pretending I had a place in the family. I wrote that I planned to focus on my own path, and I asked them not to reach out until they could show me genuine respect. My mother replied with a short note that essentially said, "We'll see you when you're done pouting." I blocked them on social media after that. For 8 long years, I navigated adulthood on my own. It was lonely at times, but I found friends who became my real support system. Eventually, I got a better paying position at a larger company. I moved to a modest, comfortable apartment and saved up enough to travel occasionally. I started seeing a wonderful partner named Danny, and for once, I experienced what it felt like to be truly seen. We built a life together that revolved around mutual encouragement, small joys, and honest conversations. I had no regrets about distancing myself from the family that never wanted me around. Life was calm until my grandpa's 80th birthday. He was the only one in the family who had ever treated me with genuine warmth. Back in the day, he would drive me to secondhand stores so we could pick up old electronics to tinker with. He'd let me wander around libraries for hours because he said reading was the best way to invest in my mind. When I dropped out of playing soccer, he was the only one who bothered to call and check in. He told me that being different was the best gift I could give myself because life would never be boring. I loved him for that. When I cut off my parents, he was the only family member who continued to send me postcards. He respected my boundaries, though, and never brought up my parents. Sometimes he'd scribble something like, "Hope you're finding happiness," and that would be that. I treasured every note. When I heard from one of my cousins that Grandpa's 80th birthday was approaching, I felt torn. I wanted to see him, but I worried about the possibility of running into my parents, sister, and brother. My cousin swore it would be a casual gathering at Grandpa's favorite restaurant. He also told me that my parents had barely been in touch with Grandpa in recent years, so they might not even show. Grandpa was living in a retirement community near the restaurant, and my cousin doubted my parents would make the flight. But he insisted Grandpa would be thrilled to see me. I went back and forth in my head, but eventually I decided I'd regret missing it. My grandpa deserved a celebration surrounded by people who loved him, and I refused to let my parents' potential presence stop me. Danny and I planned a quick weekend trip. We booked a hotel near the restaurant, figuring that if things got uncomfortable, we could leave immediately without fuss. When we arrived, I was relieved to see Grandpa's enormous grin. He looked older, yes, but his eyes still had that mischievous sparkle. He greeted me with a big hug, ignoring his walker as he leaned forward. He patted my cheek and said, "About time I saw your face again, kiddo." I felt a lump in my throat. Even though I had kept in touch through postcards, I hadn't been physically in his presence for years. He introduced me to some of his friends from the retirement community. Danny charmed them with her easy smile and warm conversation. I could see Grandpa's pride as he looked between the two of us. For the first hour or so, it was perfect. There were about 20 guests, including cousins I hadn't seen since they were in high school. Everyone mingled, nibbled on appetizers, and laughed at Grandpa's anecdotes about his younger days. Then I saw my mother walk in, followed by my father, Karina, and Kyle. I felt Danny squeeze my hand. My parents spotted me immediately, and I watched my father's expression freeze. Karina looked momentarily rattled, then plastered on that fake grin she'd perfected. My mother did a quick sweep of the room, then turned her head away from me as if I wasn't worth acknowledging. Kyle hung back. He gave me a small nod, but it felt more like a guarded gesture than a real greeting. I nodded back, mostly for Grandpa's sake, because I didn't want any drama on his big day. They settled at a separate table. The restaurant was mostly private for the evening, so we had the main dining area to ourselves, but there were enough people to keep some distance. I tried to focus on Grandpa, who was telling me about the new book he was writing. Yes, at 80, he was still writing. When my father came over, I braced myself for a confrontational sneer or a patronizing remark. Instead, he just said, "I see you're still with her." The tone of his voice made it clear he didn't approve. I forced a polite smile and introduced Danny anyway. She was gracious. My father gave a tight nod and drifted back to join my mother. They began whispering among themselves. Before dinner was served, Grandpa wanted to toast with a bit of sparkling cider. He thanked everyone for coming, told a few funny stories, and then raised his glass in my direction. He said, "I'm glad to have my granddaughter here. She's the one who always remembers to call me on holidays, even if we can't speak long. I admire her for finding her own way." The warmth in his voice almost made me tear up. I saw my mother's jaw tighten. The rest of the crowd cheered politely. Grandpa ended the toast, and dinner began. Danny and I took our seats near Grandpa, chatting with him and a couple of my cousins. I stole a glance at my parents' table. They looked aggravated, probably because they'd come expecting to be the center of attention. Karina kept flipping her hair and scanning the room as if waiting for someone more important to talk to. Kyle appeared uninterested in anything but his phone. My father's expression was sour, and my mother glared at me whenever I dared glance over. Fine, I thought, let's just get through this meal. Halfway through dinner, I excused myself to find the restroom. As I headed down the hallway, I felt a hand clamp around my arm. I whirled around to see my mother, her lips pressed together, her eyes lit with something akin to fury. She hissed, "Why are you here?" I told her calmly that Grandpa had invited me. She scoffed and said, "Don't pretend you actually care about him. You just want to make some scene and embarrass us." I stared at her, astonished at how she could twist everything into an attack on them. I reminded her that I hadn't seen them in 8 years. I had no reason or desire to cause a scene at Grandpa's birthday party. He was the only reason I was present. She responded that they'd planned on having a nice family reunion for Grandpa and that I was spoiling the atmosphere with my presence. She demanded I leave quietly so that the rest of them could celebrate properly. I told her that Grandpa wanted me here, that I wasn't going anywhere, and that if she had an issue, she should speak directly to him. She looked at me with such disdain that my stomach lurched. She walked off in a huff. I tried to let it go. Grandpa was the priority. I dried my hands, took a moment to compose myself, and returned to the table. Danny asked if everything was okay. I lied and said yes. When dessert arrived, Grandpa was thrilled. The restaurant staff had arranged a special cake, and he looked like an excited kid when they brought it out. Everyone sang, snapping pictures. I hoped that would be the end of the tension, but my parents had other plans. My mother motioned for the servers to wait, then she stood up. She announced that she had prepared a little tribute. I braced myself, but she didn't mention Grandpa at all. She launched into some speech about how proud she was of her loving family, naming Karina's recent accomplishments and Kyle's expansions in his so-called business. My father chimed in, stating that they had always been a tight-knit unit and how wonderful it was that everyone who mattered could be there to show Grandpa how supportive they were. It was painfully obvious that they were excluding me. Grandpa looked baffled. I felt anger spike, but I kept quiet for his sake. After her self-serving toast, my mother reached out toward me with a dramatic flourish. She said something like, "Despite the challenges, maybe our entire family can heal if we work together. Some people need to learn how to respect their elders, and perhaps by leaving now, certain disruptions could be avoided." Her meaning was crystal clear. I felt my hands clench into fists. At that moment, Grandpa sputtered, "Enough! This is my birthday!" But my mother pressed on, her voice dripping with false piety. She claimed I'd already caused too many upsets in the past. So if I really cared about Grandpa, I would politely step aside and let them have their piece. I was torn between standing up for myself and wanting to prevent a blowout in front of Grandpa. The guests were shifting uncomfortably. Some stared at their plates, trying to avoid the tension. Danny was about to speak up, but I placed my hand on hers. Something in me snapped, and I realized I'd had enough of their nonsense. I stood slowly, locked eyes with my mother, and told her she had no right to demand anything. I was invited here by the guest of honor himself, and no one had the authority to throw me out. I reminded her that she had made her feelings about me clear my entire life, and she didn't get to rewrite that history tonight. My father slammed his fist on the table. He declared that this was their family event, and if I had any shred of decency, I would leave. Grandpa insisted, "She's my granddaughter, she's staying." My mother tried to argue that Grandpa didn't need any more stress at his age, that I was making him upset, and that the only reason he tolerated my presence was that he felt sorry for me. I saw Grandpa's face go red. He opened his mouth to retort, but I touched his arm and quietly asked if we could talk in private. The rest of the room watched, and there was an awful hush. Grandpa nodded, and we walked carefully to a side area, leaving the rest of them to stew. Danny stayed back, presumably to keep watch over the situation. I asked Grandpa if he truly wanted me there, or if I was just imposing. He frowned and looked offended that I'd even question it. He apologized for how my parents were acting. He said he was disappointed in them. He wanted me at his party because he missed me, and because I was still family in his eyes. I felt a wave of gratitude, but then that old anger, no, more like devastation, resurfaced. I didn't understand how they could treat him like a prop while overshadowing his special day with their petty drama. He told me to stay, asked me not to let them drive me away. I promised I'd do my best not to cause any more chaos in front of him, but if they pushed, I wouldn't just meekly walk away. Grandpa sighed, nodded, and squeezed my hand. We returned to the dining area only to see my father whispering into the ear of the manager, who looked thoroughly uncomfortable. The manager approached Grandpa and me, wringing his hands. He told Grandpa that he'd received a complaint from some of the hosts and asked if we could resolve the conflict or maybe continue the celebration at home. Grandpa looked furious. He insisted that he had reserved the entire restaurant space for the night, that he was the one paying, and that nobody had the right to uninvite his granddaughter. The manager looked apologetic, but he admitted that he was under the impression my father was the one footing the bill. Grandpa shook his head in disbelief and said, "I'm covering everything." It turned out my parents had tried to intercept the payment, possibly so they'd have the authority to say who could stay. Grandpa clarified that he was paying, that he'd already put down a deposit, and that there was no question about who was hosting. The manager eventually backed off, but you could feel the tension in the air. My mother gave me a look that said, "This isn't over." I decided then and there that I was done tiptoeing. I might have left it at that, but I saw Karina smirk like she was sure they'd find some way to bully me out. My father marched up to me and demanded I show some respect, told me to honor their family structure. I told him, "I'm showing respect to the only family member who ever treated me decently, Grandpa." Maybe I shouldn't have said that in front of everyone, but I was done. My father got even angrier, and if Grandpa hadn't been present, I suspect he would have thrown a punch. Danny stepped in and calmly said, "We're going to finish celebrating with Grandpa. You don't have to like it, but that's how it is." My mother spat that I had never contributed anything to the family, that I was a disappointment from birth, and that seeing me there soured the evening. She even tried to enlist Karina's help. Karina stood and in a sickeningly sweet tone told everyone that I had always been jealous of her and that maybe if I'd tried harder, my parents wouldn't resent me so much. That stung more than I care to admit. I glared at her and said, "You have no idea what it's like to grow up knowing you'll never be enough. That's why I left." Karina rolled her eyes and said something about me playing the victim. She told me to go sulk somewhere else. At that, Grandpa snapped. He told them all to leave if they couldn't handle me being there. He reminded them it was his day, that I was staying, and that he wouldn't tolerate any more insults. My father started to speak, but Grandpa roared, "I said enough!" There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Karina and Kyle muttered something about stepping outside for air. My parents followed them. The rest of us tried to salvage the party by cutting the cake and sharing stories. People were visibly uncomfortable, but Grandpa did his best to lighten the atmosphere. Danny and I helped him open presents and took pictures with him. He gave me a thumbs up whenever we locked eyes, as if to reassure me. Some of Grandpa's friends were murmuring about how unbelievably rude my parents had been. That gave me a twisted sense of validation. Maybe I wasn't crazy for feeling unloved by them all these years. Once we'd had our fill of cake, Grandpa sat back, looking exhausted. I was about to suggest calling it a night when Karina burst back in, eyes shining with a triumphant look. She said, "We've sorted everything out. It's time for you to go, Jade." I noticed the restaurant manager standing behind her. He looked exasperated, but he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a check that clearly came from my father, the amount blank, with a note reading, "Name your price to leave." My heart pounded in disbelief. They were literally trying to pay me off to go away. The manager explained that he was just the messenger, that he was uncomfortable but had been told there would be trouble if I stayed. Grandpa tried to stand up, but I told him to rest. I waved the check in the air and asked my parents, "Is this how you handle things now? You just pay people to disappear?" My mother said, "You've always chased money, so we thought it was the best solution. Take it and go." I almost laughed. Chased money? I'd been living on a modest salary, building my life with no help from them, never asking for a dime. I calmly ripped the check into pieces and dropped them on the floor. A hush fell. Then Karina shrieked, "How dare you!" She acted like I just insulted them beyond measure. I told them, "I don't want your filthy bribe. I'm here for Grandpa." That's when my parents tried a different tactic. They started telling the manager that I was threatening them. They claimed I was dangerous, that I had been violent in the past, which was a blatant lie. They demanded he call the police to have me removed. The manager was stuck in an impossible position. Finally, Grandpa's voice rose again, trembling with anger. He barked at the manager that none of it was true, that he could call the retirement community staff and verify Grandpa was the actual client who booked the party, and that the deposit came from Grandpa's own account. Reluctantly, the manager said he believed Grandpa. But my parents kept pressing. They said Grandpa was old and confused, that he didn't know what he was doing, that he was being manipulated by me. That's when I saw tears form in Grandpa's eyes. I realized how their manipulations had run deep for years, not just toward me, but toward anyone they could control, even Grandpa, if it served their agenda. I locked eyes with Grandpa. He gave me a faint nod, as if to say it was time to stop letting them treat him like this. I said to my parents, "You're liars, you're manipulators, and if you think for 1 second that I will let you walk all over Grandpa, you're sorely mistaken." Kyle stepped forward then. He said, "I always knew you were trouble." I snapped back that if trouble meant refusing to be their punching bag, I was proud to be labeled that. Karina called me an ungrateful brat. I retorted that ungrateful was better than being toxic. My mother demanded I leave, or she'd have the police drag me out. I felt my pulse hammer, but before I could respond, the manager sighed and said, "You all need to leave the restaurant. This is too disruptive." Grandpa pleaded with him, reminding him that it was his birthday. The manager apologized but insisted that the atmosphere was too hostile and that he couldn't risk further confrontation. He asked us all to go. My parents smirked, thinking they'd won, but Grandpa signaled to me and Danny to help him gather his gifts. He said, "We're going to my house. Jade, please come." So we did. The rest of the guests followed. My parents started ordering Karina and Kyle to gather everyone, but nobody listened. People simply picked up their things and left. It felt like we were migrating away from my parents' negativity, forming a silent pact not to let them ruin the evening further. Outside, Grandpa leaned on his walker. My parents approached one last time. My father hissed, "Don't think this is over," and my mother called me a disgrace. Then Karina pushed forward, jabbing a finger at my chest, saying if I had any self-respect, I'd get lost and let the real family handle Grandpa from now on. I stared her down. I told her to keep her distance, or she'd regret it. She shrugged that off, flipping her hair like she always did when she felt superior. We bundled Grandpa into Danny's car. My parents and siblings started yelling about how I shouldn't drive him anywhere, but Grandpa had already slammed the door, telling me, "Let's just go." A small group of relatives followed in their own cars. We went to Grandpa's place and settled into his cozy living room. The older folks were exhausted and went to bed soon after. My parents didn't have a key to Grandpa's place, and the retirement community had a security gate, so we felt safe from an immediate ambush. Grandpa was still steaming. He apologized repeatedly for how the night had spiraled, but I assured him it wasn't his fault. I told him I was sorry for the tension. He patted my hand and said, "I'm proud of you for standing your ground." We stayed up talking about old times until he grew too tired to keep his eyes open. I decided we'd get a good night's sleep and figure out next steps in the morning. The next day, Grandpa told me about something my parents had done a while back. They'd tried to move him into a less expensive facility against his will. They had no power of attorney, but they kept pressuring him. He suspected they wanted to save money by forcing him somewhere cheaper. I felt rage simmering in my veins. I'd believed my parents had simply ignored Grandpa all these years, but it turned out they'd been circling like vultures, wanting to claim his assets. Grandpa said he'd been receiving calls from Karina and Kyle, hinting that it was time for Grandpa to distribute certain funds so they could invest in business opportunities or pay for expansions in their lavish lifestyles. Grandpa said he didn't owe them a thing. Then he dropped the real bomb. He intended to leave everything to me. I was stunned. I told him I appreciated the gesture, but that I didn't want to cause more drama. Grandpa said it was his decision, and the only drama was coming from the ones who felt entitled to his money. He insisted he wanted to protect me too, because he suspected they'd come after me eventually. Over the following weeks, Grandpa worked with his lawyer to finalize everything. He told me that he'd wanted to do this for a while, but had hesitated, hoping his kids might develop some decency. Instead, they tried to bulldoze him at his own birthday party. I stayed with him during that time, helping him with errands, enjoying his company. Danny returned to work, but visited when she could. The retirement community staff was kind, and they adored Grandpa, which reinforced my belief that he was where he wanted to be. My parents tried calling, demanding to know where Grandpa was. He refused to speak to them. Karina left me furious voicemails. Kyle tried to act suave, claiming he just wanted to talk. We ignored them all. When the will was set, Grandpa invited them for a family meeting plus a few extended relatives. He said he wanted everything in the open. I was nervous, but Grandpa insisted. He was done letting them walk all over him. The meeting took place in the retirement community's lounge. My parents arrived, looking smug, probably expecting Grandpa to placate them. Karina and Kyle showed up with forced smiles, greeting everyone as though nothing had happened. The lawyer opened the meeting by stating Grandpa's final wishes. When my parents realized Grandpa was leaving the bulk of his estate to me, their outrage filled the room. My father shouted that this was elder abuse, that I had manipulated Grandpa. My mother threatened to sue. Karina shrieked that I had always been jealous and was now stealing from them. Kyle tried to argue that Grandpa must be losing his faculties, but Grandpa remained calm. He told them plainly that nobody was losing anything they deserved. He said he was dividing small portions among them, but that the majority would go to me. My parents exploded, but the lawyer laid out everything in black and white, explaining how Grandpa was mentally competent and had the right to allocate his assets as he pleased. That's when my mother lunged toward me, hurling accusations that I had planned all of this. She ranted that I'd deliberately shown up after 8 years to isolate Grandpa. She demanded I confess that I was just waiting for him to die so I could get my hands on his money. I looked her in the eye and told her she was projecting her own intentions onto me. Karina started pointing a finger in my face, calling me names, spitting venom. My father said he'd fight me in court until I had nothing left. He threatened that I'd regret stealing from them. I felt a renewed surge of that old, helpless hurt. Then I remembered all the nights I'd cried, all the humiliations, all the times they'd written me off as worthless. They had done nothing but demean me. If they wanted a war, I was prepared to see it through. The lawyer calmly explained that any legal challenge would be futile. Grandpa had documented everything meticulously, and a doctor had verified his sound mind just days before. Still, my parents raged. They tried to intimidate Grandpa into changing his mind. I watched as Karina tried to guilt-trip him with tears, telling him how she saved lives for a living, how she was the real achiever in the family. Grandpa wasn't moved. Kyle bragged about his big business deals and how much he could do with Grandpa's inheritance. Grandpa reminded him that he never saw any results from Kyle's big talk. Then Grandpa turned to my parents, told them he'd loved them once, but that they'd abandoned any sense of decency. He told them he was ashamed of their behavior. I almost cried hearing him say that, but I kept my composure. I expected a lawsuit. Instead, they tried to corner me outside the lounge, insisting we talk. They offered me a deal. If I refused Grandpa's inheritance and signed it over to them, they'd let me remain in the family. The absurdity of that offer stunned me. I told them I had no desire to be part of their toxic circle. My mother said, "Then you'll watch your back." I stared her down and replied, "I've been watching it for years, thanks to you." They saw I was serious. We parted ways that day, and they left in a cloud of threats. Grandpa passed a couple of years later, peacefully. I was heartbroken, but I was there holding his hand. He left me everything as promised. My parents tried one last stunt, claiming Grandpa's will had been forged, but the courts threw their case out. They never apologized, never admitted to any wrongdoing. They hated me with renewed vigor. For a moment, I considered bridging the gap, if only to pay tribute to Grandpa's memory. But then I remembered every humiliation, every insult, the attempt to bribe me to leave his birthday party. They'd never once shown remorse. I felt no obligation to forgive. I made sure everything Grandpa left me was placed in investments he would have approved of, including a scholarship fund for underprivileged students who wanted to study engineering or technology, something that aligned with what Grandpa used to encourage in me. My parents tried to hound me for a piece of that fund, but I had my own lawyer by then, and I refused all their demands. In the end, Karina's life took a downturn as she racked up debt from a failed private clinic project. Kyle got entangled in lawsuits over shady businesses. My parents tried to spin a story that I had robbed them of resources they needed to help Kyle and Karina out of their crises. But nobody bought that tale. Extended family members saw how they treated Grandpa at his own birthday celebration, how they tried to pay me off, how they insulted him in the final months of his life. Their reputations were ruined among people who actually mattered. I stayed out of their orbit. They reached out once, ironically, to see if I might consider sharing resources to help Kyle. I almost laughed. Instead, I sent a brief note informing them that the only reason I'd reply was to make my answer clear. Never contact me again. Some might say revenge is never satisfying, but in this case, it was just and it was final. They labeled me the family failure, dismissed me for years, then tried to bar me from my own grandpa's birthday celebration. They lost, and I have no sympathy for them. If they had shown even an ounce of genuine remorse or love for Grandpa, maybe things would have been different. But they sealed their own fate. Grandpa's legacy lives on in the scholarship fund and in my heart. Whenever I see a student tinkering with an old circuit board or writing an unconventional project proposal, I think of him and smile. I'm proud to say I turned out just fine without my parents' approval. I found success, built a circle of supportive friends, married Danny, and honored Grandpa's memory by passing on his kindness to those who deserve it. Meanwhile, my parents remain trapped in the misery they created for themselves. It still astonishes me how far they were willing to go to erase me. They never expected Grandpa to see through their manipulations. But he did, and he ensured that the only person who bothered to treat him well in the later years was the one rewarded in the end. People ask if I'd ever forgive them. Absolutely not. They didn't just hurt me, they tormented Grandpa when he was vulnerable. I have no room in my life for that kind of hatred. Grandpa taught me that not all family is worth keeping. It took me years to realize, but he was right. Freeing myself from them was the best decision I ever made. They can't touch me now, and I owe them nothing. I'm sharing this because I want people to know they're not obligated to forgive those who betray them. Sometimes, cutting ties and living a better life is the only valid option. I learned that once someone shows you who they are, you should believe them. My parents showed me repeatedly that they were cruel, manipulative, and incapable of love unless it served them. Trying to please them would have only destroyed my own happiness. Walking away didn't make me the bad guy. It allowed me to protect what little self-worth I had left. The irony is that in walking away, I found genuine love and ended up with the inheritance they coveted. It wasn't about the money, it was about knowing that Grandpa believed in me, saw my worth, and stood up for me when nobody else did. That, more than any financial windfall, is what truly matters. I still remember the last words Grandpa said to me before he passed. He squeezed my hand and whispered, "You did good, kiddo." I carry that with me every day. Even though my parents never believed I could amount to anything, Grandpa did. That validation was priceless, especially given how starved I had been for acceptance. It was also a reminder that I didn't need my parents' approval or forgiveness. All I needed was to believe in my own worth, surround myself with people who cared, and let the rest crumble on its own. My parents' betrayal might have once broken me, but their attempt to kick me out of Grandpa's celebration was the catalyst that freed me completely from their toxic grip. I hope they think of that moment whenever they feel entitled to something they never earned. I hope they remember my face when I tore that blank check in half. There was no reconciliation, no heartfelt apologies. Only consequences for their actions and the knowledge that I have no regrets about how it all ended. Sometimes, the best revenge is living the life they insisted you could never have, and I'm doing exactly that.